The Defiant's shields flared as alien plasma torpedoes detonated against them, the human warship already taking heavy fire from the 1,000-strong Una's fleet, hell-bent on massacring the human colony below. In the captain's chair, Anthony Clark gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He had no choice but to fight, even against impossible odds. To flee now would doom millions of innocent humans to a fate worse than death at the scaly claws of the barbaric reptilian Unas. Clark had battled the vicious Unas warlord Rigel dozens of times before in his long military career. Rigel was notorious for exterminating human colonies, seizing their resources and enslaving any survivors for his cruel empire. 50 years ago, Clark's own parents were killed when the once-allied Unas betrayed humanity in a surprise attack that slaughtered millions. The horrific war that followed forged Clark into a hardened warrior, his heart as cold as the void of space. He had seen too many worlds burned and bones picked clean by Una's raiding parties. As the only ship close enough to answer the colony's desperate distress call in time, the Defiant raced through hyperspace, alarms blaring as the crew prepared for the fight of their lives. Clark addressed them over the intercom, his voice steady. "This is it. 1,000 to 1 odds. We all know those Unas bastards down there won't stop until every man, woman and child in that colony is dead or in chains. I won't lie to you. We might not make it out of this, but we're the only thing standing between our people and oblivion. Whatever happens, we send a message today. Even alone, humanity does not abandon its own. We will make the Unas regret ever setting foot on our world, battle stations." The crew replied with steely nods, grim faces set in determination. They knew what was at stake. Parents, siblings, lovers, millions of lives hung in the balance, helpless. As the Defiant dropped out of warp and the Una's fleet came into view, a colossal swarm of cruel-looking dagger-shaped ships, Clark narrowed his eyes. Outnumbered 1,000 to 1, the Defiant looked like an ant before a tsunami of steel. On the bridge, threat alarms suddenly screamed as sensors registered a massive salvo of incoming plasma torpedoes, too many to dodge. "Brace for impact," Clark roared, diverting power to forward shields. The deck lurched under his feet as the first torpedoes struck in blinding flashes of fire. The battle was joined, the fate of millions in the balance. Humanity's darkest hour had arrived. The Defiant's shields lit up brilliantly under the relentless barrage of Una's torpedoes, turning the void of space into a dazzling light show of destruction. But even the Defiant's advanced defenses couldn't withstand the sheer volume of fire. Explosions blossomed along the human warship's armored hull as the shields failed and torpedoes impacted, tearing through metal like it was paper. On the bridge, emergency klaxons wailed and the lights flickered ominously. Clark wrenched the control sticks, rolling the ship in a desperate attempt to evade the last of the salvo. Torpedoes streaked by, barely missing as the Defiant heaved. Damage reports flooded Clark's console. Breaches on decks 4, 7, 13. Casualties mounting. The ship was being hammered to pieces. "Return fire all batteries," Clark snarled through gritted teeth. The Defiant's cannon turrets swiveled, locking onto targets. They unleashed a storm of depleted uranium slugs, each one accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The hypersonic armor-piercing rounds punched through the shields of a dozen Una's ships like they were tissue paper, shredding hulls and detonating reactors. Una's destroyers vanished in blinding fireballs. On the bridge of his command ship, Rigel roared with primal rage as he watched the Defiant tear through his fleet. His reptilian eyes narrowed to furious slits. "Surround that ship. Grapple it and send in the boarding parties. I want every human on board dead or dragged before me in chains," Rigel hissed, slamming a clawed fist onto the arm of his command chair. Dozens of Una's ships swarmed the Defiant, plasma cannons blazing. Clark sent the human ship into a wild corkscrew maneuver, the inertial dampeners straining to compensate as the crew worked frantically to keep the battered vessel in the fight. Hundreds of Una's attack craft poured from the launching bays of the alien motherships, agile fighters and heavily armored assault shuttles loaded with bloodthirsty shock troops. The Defiant's point defense guns opened up, filling space with a deadly lattice of flak. Scores of Una's fighters vanished in puffs of shredded metal and vaporized gases. But it wasn't enough. There were too many. Una's fighters strafed the Defiant, blasting armor and weapon emplacements. The human ship shuddered under the impacts. Assault shuttles slammed into the Defiant's hull like giant battering rams, attaching on collision courses. Airlocks were blasted open, and squads of massive reptilian shock troops in powered armor boiled out, plasma rifles blazing. The thunder of renewed close-quarters combat echoed through the human ship's corridors as Clark's Marines fought back in brutal room-to-room fighting. Clark knew the Defiant couldn't take much more of this brutal punishment. His eyes flicked to the tactical display and widened as he spied a cluster of massive Una's troop transports burning hard towards the human colony. If those reached the surface, it was all over. The colony would be lost. "Hard to port. Bring us about and target those troop ships," Clark roared. The helmsman looked at him like he was insane, but obeyed. The Defiant heaved into a sudden turn, diving directly into the heart of the Una's fleet. It was a suicide run, one ship against 1,000. But Clark was out of options. Every second bought for the colony was a victory. The Defiant charged forward, engines flaring, guns erupting in staccato fury, an avenging angel blazing with wrath amidst a horde of demons. Clark gripped the arms of his command chair, his eyes locked on the displays. This was humanity's darkest hour, and he would make the Unas pay for every second of it. Clark set his face in a grim mask of determination as he wrenched the Defiant's controls, thrusters blazing as he hurled the ship into the heart of the Unas armada. Rigel's ships scattered in all directions, desperate to evade the human warship's guns, as Clark shouted orders to divert every scrap of power to engines and weapons. "Punch through those bastards! Get us to the troop ships before they reach the colony," Clark roared. The Defiant charged forward like a furious god of war, cannon batteries erupting in thunder. Depleted uranium slugs ripped through the void at relativistic velocities, tearing into Una's ships and blasting them apart from the inside out. Dozens of alien vessels disintegrated under the onslaught, turned to plumes of fire and debris. Hundreds of Una's soldiers and crew died screaming as the Defiant ruthlessly shredded their ships, carving a path of annihilation towards the troop transports. Rigel watched the slaughter unfold on his displays, eyes blazing with incandescent fury. "Concentrate all fire on that human filth. Blast them out of the stars," the Unas warlord bellowed. Just as the Defiant's guns swiveled to target the vulnerable troop ships, Rigel's mighty dreadnought unleashed the full power of its weapons. A storm of plasma torpedoes and rail slugs hammered into the human ship, sending it careening off course in a trail of fire and molten armor. The Defiant's bridge dissolved into chaos. Overloaded power conduits blew out in fountains of sparks, starting electrical fires. Crewmen screamed as the deck lurched beneath them, inertial dampeners failing. Damage alarms shrieked, and acrid smoke choked the air. Clark barely kept his footing, hands flying over the controls as he fought to stabilize their wild tumble. "Damage report!" he barked over the din of combat. "Hull breaches on decks 2 through 7. Weapons offline, engines not responding," an officer shouted back, terror etched on her face. "We're dead in the water, sir." Clark felt his blood turn to ice as he stared at the display in horrified realization. The Defiant was crippled, helpless before the enemy's guns, and Rigel's dreadnought was closing in for the kill, its spinal rail cannon glowing hellishly as it prepared to fire the final shot that would crack the human ship open and spill its crew into cold oblivion. In that instant, a desperate, insane plan crystallized in Clark's mind with diamond clarity. Their guns were useless, but they had one last card to play, a weapon of last resort, never before tested in battle. He slapped the ship's intercom. "All hands prep the Singularity torpedoes. I want them armed and in the tubes now." Shocked silence greeted his words. The Singularity torpedoes were experimental weapons, devastating prototypes that generated short-lived artificial black holes on detonation. Anything caught within their gravity wells would be crushed into oblivion. But they were unguided and had to be fired at near point-blank range to have any chance of hitting a moving target. Using them now was tantamount to suicide. As Clark watched Rigel's dreadnought loom ever closer on the displays, he knew it was their only hope. He reached for the intercom again, steeling himself. "All hands, abandon." A chorus of voices cut him off before he could finish the order. His bridge crew, bloodied but unbeaten, glaring at him with fire in their eyes. "With respect, Captain, shut the hell up. We're seeing this through." "This is our fight too, sir. We're with you to the end." "One ship, one crew. We live or die together." Clark stared at his people, humbled by their courage, their devotion, their sheer balls-out defiance in the face of certain death. He nodded slowly, a lump in his throat. Okay, you magnificent bastards. Arm the torpedoes and divert everything we've got left to the forward shields and thrusters. We're going to ram that scaly fuck." Rigel watched the human ship turn ponderously towards him, lining up for a kamikaze run, and let out a hissing laugh. Pitiful, as if their suicidal charge could penetrate his vastly superior shields. He would swat them like the insects they were. The Defiant accelerated towards the Una's dreadnought, maneuvering thrusters firing as Clark set them on a collision course. Rigel's ship opened up with every gun, filling space with searing plasma and kinetic slugs. The Defiant's forward shields flared and failed almost instantly, and then the human ship was taking the full brunt of the barrage, its hull shredding like foil. Consoles exploded, and bulkheads blew in as the Defiant died by inches under the dreadnought's pounding guns. Crewmen were sent flying like ragdolls, turned to bloody mist by shrapnel. Acrid smoke filled the air as fires raged out of control. The lights went out, plunging the bridge into darkness, broken only by flickering emergency lighting. And still the Defiant charged forward, engines straining as Clark held his battered ship on course through sheer force of will. Closer and closer, until Rigel's dreadnought filled the forward viewports, until they could see the Una's warlord's stunned face staring back at them. At the last possible instant, Clark slammed a fist onto the firing button. A trio of singularity torpedoes burst from the Defiant's tubes, streaking towards the dreadnought. Then the human ship's reactor containment failed, and a new sun bloomed into existence as the Defiant slammed into the dreadnought's shields and vanished in an apocalyptic blast. But the singularity torpedoes hit first. The singularity torpedoes streaked through the void, propelled by the Defiant's last desperate gasp. They struck Rigel's dreadnought, and reality itself screamed. 3 miniature black holes burst into existence, mere meters from the Una's ship's hull, their gravity an irresistible maelstrom of destruction. The dreadnought's shields flared brilliantly for a split second, a gossamer bubble straining against forces that could shred stars. Then they popped like a soap bubble, and the black holes sank their fangs into the ship's hull. Rigel had a single instant to comprehend the doom descending on him. His reptilian eyes widened in pure terror as the view outside his bridge dissolved into a kaleidoscopic nightmare. Then the bulkheads imploded and the black holes ripped into the ship. The dreadnought died in a cosmic scream of tortured metal. Armor plates crumpled like tin foil, sucked into the swirling accretion disks forming around the ravenous singularities. The ship's spine snapped, and its hull peeled open, spilling crew and equipment into the unforgiving void. Rigel's body spasmed as the G-forces exceeded anything he had ever trained for. His scales split as his blood literally boiled in his veins from the extreme tidal forces. The warlord barely had time to open his mouth in a silent shriek before he was spaghettified, every cell in his body unraveling like string as he vanished into the black hole's gaping maw. The singularities devoured the entire dreadnought in seconds, ripping it apart on the atomic level. Molecules came unglued, and even atoms themselves shredded into their component protons and neutrons before winking out of existence beyond the event horizon. When the last scrap of hull vanished into the black holes, they evaporated in a final burst of Hawking radiation, a spherical blast wave that slammed into the Defiant like the fist of an angry god. Clark's dying ship was already a ruin, its hull more holes than armor. As the blast wave hit, it sent the cruiser tumbling end over end, a lifeless hulk spilling bodies and debris. Rivets became bullets, popping out of their sockets to ricochet through compartments. Bulkheads that had weathered the storm of Una's fire now groaned and gave way, collapsing like crumpled paper. On the bridge, Clark diverted the last trickle of power from the fading reactors into structural integrity fields in a frantic attempt to hold his ship together just a few moments longer. The inertial dampeners failed completely, and the G-forces from the wild tumble piled onto him like an elephant sitting on his chest. He felt ribs crack and tasted blood as his organs were pummeled inside his body. "Hold together, baby, hold together," he hissed through gritted teeth, his hands clenched around the armrests in a futile death grip as the whole ship screamed and juddered around him. Proximity alarms added their shrill tones to the ear-splitting cacophony, their sensors picking up the wall of Una's ships descending on the Defiant's position, eager to avenge their murdered warlord. The Dreadnought's destruction had only enraged them, 1,000 ships thirsty for human blood. Clark barked a harsh laugh, his vision tunneling as the G-forces mounted. Let them come. The Defiant's guns were scrap, its shields just atoms scattered across the void. They had nothing left to fight with, and he'd be damned if he'd let those scaly bastards take him alive. At least they'd hurt the Unas today, more than anyone had dared hope. His crew had bought precious time for the colony to evacuate, and he couldn't think of a better reason to die. "Good job, everyone," he called out, barely audible over the screech of tearing metal. "They'll be telling stories about this one." He thought he heard a ragged cheer from the crew pits, but it might have just been the comm system shorting out. Alarm lights flashed a dizzy kaleidoscope across the bridge, casting mad shadows through the smoke billowing from shattered consoles. He closed his eyes, shutting out the madness. "See you soon, Mum and Dad," he whispered, hoping there was enough left of his body for a proper burial so he could be with them again, the family reunited after so long. The singularities flickered out, their lifespan exhausted, and the Defiant finally crumpled like a soda can under a boot. Hull plates peeled back, and exploding consoles became lethal geysers of metal shards. The ship's spine snapped with a tortured shriek, tearing the cruiser nearly in half. Cracks raced through the bridge viewports under the stress, and the transparent aluminum gave way, explosive decompression sucking the air from the room in a hurricane rush. Clark barely had time to gasp before 1,000 Una's ships opened fire as one, the massed salvos of their plasma cannons and railguns stitching the Defiant from bow to stern. The crippled ship vanished in a boil of nuclear fire, its reactors finally giving up the ghost. A miniature sun blossomed in the void, shredding armor and disintegrating crew. When the glare faded, there was nothing left but an expanding cloud of debris, bits of molten hull spinning lazily through the void. The Defiant and all aboard had been reduced to their component atoms, blasted to plasma and vapor by the Una's vengeance. Rumors spread like wildfire through the Una's fleet, whispered tales of a ghost ship striking from the shadows, leaving nothing but death and ruin in its wake. On 100 worlds, soldiers gathered in hushed clumps, scales twitching with unease as they recounted the stories. Ships found drifting and abandoned, their crews slaughtered to the last Unas, outposts reduced to molten slag with no warning or mercy. Morale crumbled like sand as the name of the Defiant echoed through the ranks, the human warship that had burned 1,000 Una's vessels from the stars in its final blaze of glory. The name that had once been a badge of honor for any soldier to face in battle had become a cursed utterance, a guttural sound that stuck in the throats of even hardened veterans. Fear coiled in their guts like icy serpents, the primal terror of a prey species that knows a perfect predator stalks the shadows. In the halls of power, the Una's leadership raged at their soldiers' cowardice, their shameful display unbefitting a warrior race. But even they could not fully suppress the unease prickling beneath their scales, the unshakable sense that an unseen blade hovered at their throats. Desperate for answers, for any scrap of information that could banish the specter haunting their forces, they hatched a plan. A covert team, the best infiltrators the Unas possessed, was dispatched to human space with a single mission: find proof of the Defiant's destruction, irrefutable evidence to crush the rumors and restore the confidence of their soldiers. If the Defiant was truly gone, shattered to atoms in its final blaze of glory, Then the Unas could focus on rooting out whatever upstart human commander was using its legend to play havoc with their morale. The team struck like vipers, sliding through the shadows of a human space station with fluid grace. Claws tapped like rain on a data terminal, slicing through firewalls and decryption algorithms like a molecular blade through flesh. The Unas were masters of this art, the art of ripping secrets, kicking and screaming from the dark places where they slept. Sifting through the stolen data with predatory focus, they struck gold. Video footage from the colony's evacuation, a panicked stampede of humans fleeing their homes as Unas warships darkened the skies. The footage was chaotic, a dizzying swirl of terrified faces and frantic motion, but the Unas team watched it with a coldly analytical eye, searching for any scrap of information about the Defiant's fate. And then they saw it, a single escape pod amid the exodus, a tiny mote of metal drifting against the stars. Their claws tapped a rapid staccato, zooming the footage in, sharpening the resolution until the pod's viewport stood out in crystal clarity. What they saw turned their blood to ice in their veins. Anthony Clark, his face a ruined canvas of burns and lacerations, floating in a healing tank within the pod. His shattered body was a patchwork of jagged bone and pulped meat knitting slowly back together, a testament to the savagery of his final battle. But even through the mask of his injuries, his features were unmistakable. The enemy's greatest nemesis, the Unas' nightmare-made flesh, was still alive. As the truth sank in, talons gouged furrows in the terminal's haptic interface, a subconscious expression of the white-hot rage and disbelief boiling in the infiltrator's guts. Clark lived. The Defiant's last charge had been a feint, a final misdirection to cover the escape of their captain. The Unas had been duped, deceived in their moment of ultimate triumph. But as the team leader studied Clark's ruined face with a hunter's eye, he noticed something that froze the fury in his veins. The timestamp on the footage, a string of human script burnt into the corner of the display, a timestamp that placed the footage nearly a full cycle before the present day. The implications crashed over the infiltrator like a tsunami, staggering him back on his haunches as the terrible realization crystallized in his mind. If Clark had been found so long ago, then who had been waging a campaign of terror against the Unas for the last quarter cycle? Who had been striking from the shadows with the Defiant's signature savagery, if not the man who had commanded her? The answer came in a storm of blinding light and searing plasma. The space station bucked and heaved as a salvo of quantum torpedoes struck home, reducing decks and bulkheads to molten slag in the blink of an eye. Proximity alarms screamed like damned souls as the Unas team was hurled from their feet, the tortured metal of the station shrieking as it was peeled back like the skin of a fruit. Clambering upright amid the smoke and ruin, the infiltrators stared out through the torn hull into the void beyond. A human warship hung against the stars, its sleek lines and predatory angles unmistakable. It had appeared as if from nowhere, a spectre of retribution made steel. And on its bridge, glimpsed through the flash of explosions and the haze of debris, stood Anthony Clark. His eyes were twin crucibles of hatred, his face a death mask of cold fury. But his body was whole and unscarred, a thing of lethal perfection unmarked by the ruin the Unas had seen in the footage. In that moment, the terrible truth unfolded before the infiltrators like a nightmare made real. The Clark they had seen was not the ghost the Unas so feared. He was something far worse. He was the first, the template, the father of a new breed of monster. An army of genetic abominations, bearing the face of the Unas' greatest foe, grown in secret and seeded across the stars, an avenging horde of super soldiers driven by a singular purpose, to scour the Unas from the face of the galaxy. As realization curdled into horror in the pit of the team leader's stomach, reports lit up the comm channels like funeral pyres, 100 worlds burning, human soldiers appearing as if from the ether, butchering without mercy, then vanishing like smoke. 1,000 Clarks, 1,000 Defiants, an endless tide of retribution. And far away in the heart of Unas space, the true Clark smiled a cold and mirthless smile. The Unas had sown the seeds of this war in the ashes of his homeworld. Now, at long last, it was time to reap the whirlwind. The monsters had come home to roost. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.